From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. During the pandemic, there's been intense interest in new things you can do at home, new hobbies, maybe playing the guitar or running your first compost. Beekeeping is certainly in that list. There's a lot of new beekeepers who are taking up beekeeping. They ordered the equipment in, maybe they've ordered the bees in, and then they're kind of faced with, oh, this is quite complicated. Well, in this episode, I have invited the very first master level beekeepers, Anna Ashby and Amber Reece. They were the first beekeepers to achieve this master level here in Oregon, the Oregon Master Beekeeping Program, and they're going to devote this episode to the 10 most common questions they get from people who are just starting out. So if you're just starting out in beekeeping, this episode is for you. So without further ado, this week on Pollination, the most common beginner beekeeping questions with Anna Ashby and Amber Reece, Master Beekeeper Extraordinaires. Right. This is a great episode. We're going to have the two first graduated master beekeepers in Oregon on the show. So let me just welcome Amber.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks for joining us, Anna.
Thank you for having me as well.
Okay. So what we've done is you guys as master beekeepers, master level beekeepers are really responsible for, very high level advice to all sorts of beekeepers, including beginner beekeepers. And I thought in this episode, we'd really focus on common questions that you both have gotten from beginner beekeepers. And Amber, I want to start with you. You and both of you submitted questions to me in advance. These are questions that you have heard. And so the first question is, I'm a beginner beekeeper, and they come to you and they say, what species of honeybee should I start with?
Yeah, that's a very, very common question that I get asked numerous times when I'm out doing presentations. And basically, there are two main types of bees or races that most beginning beekeepers start with, and they are the Italians and the Carnioleans. The Italian honeybee is probably the more common bee to be kept in managed hives. And one of the reasons why is because it's known for creating large populations, and they're excellent honey producers. They also have a very extremely mild temperament, so they're a very gentle bee to work with. And they're not, and I don't know if this is a correct term or not, they're not as swarmy as some other bees, although they will tend to swarm as well. The one thing that you do need to watch out for is that they do tend to have large winter populations. And so you'll need to really look and watch that when you're in the throes of winter, because they can go through their honey stores pretty quickly. So you'll have to watch for signs of starvation. The second type of bee that most beginning beekeepers will start with is the Carniolean. They're also referred to as carnies, and they were developed in the regions of Slovenia and the Balkan area. And they also are very calm and have a gentle temperament. And what's kind of neat about those bees that's beneficial for us here in the Pacific Northwest is that they developed in kind of a cold, wet region. And so these bees will sometimes get out on days that maybe the Italians won't get out because it'll be a little bit colder. And the one thing, though, to watch with these bees is that they're very prone to swarming. And so especially when that nectar flow hits, so you'll want to watch that. You don't want your bees to all of a sudden start swarming when you're trying to get that nectar flow going and trying to get as much honey being produced at that time. So those are the two most common. And then once beekeepers really start getting years under their belt, they might want to experiment with hybrid bees, the Russians and the hygienic queens. But I think the Italians and Carniolians are probably the best bees to start with.
I was going to say that, implicit in the question, I think, to most people, when they ask what species of honeybee, they don't realize that at least in the Western, what we have here are all one species. And so you've pointed out that these are actually just the bees, the populations that we have in North America are kind of sampling of populations from Europe that sort of.
Right. And that these are, they're non-native. So honeybees are non-native to the U.S. Yeah. And so these two races of bees are the most common. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. All right. That's helps us dispel that first step. And I guess the question we'll move on to is people want to, what kind of bee should I start with? Anna, I imagine you've put as one of the questions that people are frequently ask you, and I imagine this time of year it's intense. Where do I purchase queens, nukes, and package bees? How do you answer that question?
Well, since this is going throughout the United States and wherever the radio waves go, Google is your friend. If you are in the U.S., I would Google bee clubs in your state or bee clubs in your area and see what comes up and talk to them. Craigslist, again, I don't know if Craigslist is international, but look on there. The local paper want ads. Facebook, beekeeping groups, you can ask there. And then beekeeping suppliers. Again, Google is your friend, or some internet search engine. Just Google beekeeping suppliers and see what they have. And then you could say beekeeping suppliers in your area. They will know, and then you can contact them. I'm sure they would love that.
I imagine for some people, the whole notion of a beekeeping supplier seems foreign to them, that there are these companies in many major U.S. cities that actually stock all the things that you need. You can go into a storeroom, at least, there's not restrictions, and you can see the stuff.
Mm-hmm. And you can get bees mailed to you, which delights the post office, I'm sure. Or you can drive to a pickup place and pick them up. You can get nukes or packages that way. Queens the same way. Or you could just set up and look for a swarm. Get on swarm lists. So those would be my thoughts.
I remember we had an episode with Mandy Shaw from Portland Urban Beekeepers, and she pointed out in the span of a year, putting her name on the local swarm list. So a lot of the beekeeping clubs have a list so that when somebody calls in and says, "Oh, there's a swarm," they call them. And then so Mandy would get these calls, and she was able to get all her bees through these swarms. Clearly, for somebody starting out, that is not the way to go. That's a more advanced way of getting bees.
It'd be very intimidating for a new beekeeper.
But you did mention as well that the bee clubs, that there are these are great ways to learn any of these intro questions. There's usually a network or a community in most major cities where there'll be people there like Anna and Amber. You both belong to bee clubs who can give you advice directly.
Yes.
All right. Well, it does raise the question, which is Amber's next question that people frequently ask, is how much does it cost to get started in beekeeping? How much before I can go to the flow hive and pour the honey onto my toast in the morning like I saw in the commercial?
Well, let's address the flow hive on another episode of pollination.
All right.
We will assume that the beginning beekeeper is going to start out with a traditional hive setup, and that's using the Langstroth hive. Keep in mind, beekeeping can be an expensive hobby when you're first starting out, and starting out with brand new equipment. If you're lucky enough and you know somebody, perhaps you can get loaners equipment or used equipment. But keep in mind, it can get expensive fast. And what I would recommend is that you do a lot of reading first, participate in a bee school and or join your local bee club to make sure that this is actually an enterprise that you want to take on. Because beekeeping, it's changed. It's no longer about just putting boxes out in your backyard and just letting them be. Letting them be. You can't just let them do their own thing anymore. It's going to involve management, time management, your time, and so a lot of thought needs to go into this before just running out to the store and purchasing your supplies, because these are living beings, and some folk, consider them livestock, and so you want to be able to have the time to take care of them. Okay. And also know too that these are not going to be just one-time fixed costs. They're going to have annual costs too. There's going to be upkeep costs of your woodenware, so there's going to be replacements. And something else to keep in mind too is that it's recommended for beginning beekeepers to start with not one hive, but two, if your location can support that, because it gives you greater flexibility to be able to balance out the two hives if you need to. If one's a little bit weaker, it offers you some combining opportunities as well. Okay, so having mentioned that, whether or not you start with an 8-frame traditional Langstroth hive setup or a 10-frame, and you purchase all your tools, your safety equipment, and also the purchase of the bees, for a one hive setup, you're looking at about $650 to $700. Add a second hive to that and add an additional $400, which includes the purchase of your bees. As Anna had mentioned, packages and nooks and stuff. And so that's involving those costs as well. So start up for about 2 hives, you're looking at close to $1,000. That's with brand new equipment.
And I remember an episode we did with Kim Flottam, and he started a beekeeping journal called 3 Years in Beekeeping, because those first 3 years, the colonies may not survive. You kind of are still learning. And so those expenses on that front end can be a big investment.
Yeah, and there will be some frustration for those first 2 years for beginning beekeepers. Be prepared to lose a colony or two, and we learn from those. Those are learning experiences, and that's another benefit to start with 2 hives in case one of them doesn't make it. That way, there's not as much discouragement. But yeah, it's not an inexpensive hobby.
Okay, thanks for setting that up. And I guess this leads to Anna's question. I've heard this question a lot. Why would I want to treat my bees with chemicals? I want them to live naturally. How do you answer that question of, why would you, if you're keeping bees, why would you even want to use chemicals?
If you want your bees to stay alive, you need to in this day and age, unfortunately. So when we say chemicals, that doesn't necessarily mean something harsh. Maybe is not. I'll have to think about that, and then we'll backtrack a little bit. The reason for doing any sort of intervention in the bees is because we need to control a parasite, which is called the varroa mite. which as a beginning beekeeper, you'll start hearing about a lot. And if you do not control the varroa mite, your hive will die, most likely the first fall or winter. That's just the long and short of it. So to be a responsible beekeeper, or like Amber said, livestock owner, you need to give the bees the tools, which is lack of pressure from the parasite, so that they can survive. So these varroa mites feed on the bees and also vector viruses. So they compromise the bees' immune system. So they're compromised. And then they're injecting them with viruses, and they leave an open wound so the viruses have ready access to the bee's body. And typically that's what kills the colony. So by using chemicals of some sort, and we'll talk about that in a moment, then there's reduced pressure on the bees, so the bees then are healthier and are more likely to survive. Especially as a beginning beekeeper, there's so much to learn. Eventually down the road, if you want to explore other options, and there are, and we can talk about that, other management options, you just need to learn how to handle bees and learn the bees' life cycle and going through all the manipulations that you do. So it's just one less thing for a new beekeeper to learn. And it's all about the timing.
It just reminds me of what Amber said about learning. Your bees are going to die in learning. And if there's so many other reasons why a bee colony will die in your first few years, if you can at least know that the mites are under control, it allows you to learn. I think I wintered too small a colony, or I didn't feed them enough. Varroa will just cancel all those lessons out.
Yes, it will. And so then once you've successfully overwintered bees for more than 1 year, so it's not just a fluke, then you will have more knowledge and skills under your belt, and you can start looking into more manipulative things like keeping the queen from laying for a period of time. So you give a brood break, or using drone comb removal, or getting the hygienic queens. There's lots that you can do but they take a lot of time. And again, it's all timing. You can't go off to a family wedding, and you can't go on vacation. You are a slave to the bees.
But these are methods of controlling varroa mites that, without chemicals, but they do require you need some technique. You need some skill. You can't do this right off the bat. Even if you read it in the book and somebody's like, this is the best thing, it's like they're fairly hard techniques.
Yes, they are.
Okay, that's great. Well, it's not great. It's terrible. I wish we didn't have these parasites.
I know.
Okay, well, the next question, Amber, is where should I place my hives? I imagine you get that all the time. I'm starting to put shrubs in my yard, and it's like, where do I put them? It's the same kind of question. Where do I put the hives? How do you answer that question?
Right. Well, the first thing to ask yourself, or if somebody's asking that question, is, do you even have permission in the first place to place those hives where you want to? So are you placing them on your property, your private property, or are you wanting to place them in a public area? So make sure you've got permission first. And also, where they'll be located, are they going to be secure, or are they going to be out of harm's way? Are they protected by fencing if you've got large animals on your property? So make sure that you can place them in an area that there's security for them. And also place them in an area where you can easily assess them. So if you're living on property that is fairly large and you have to cross 2 creeks to get to, and you're carrying all this material with you, and you've got to go, quarter mile to get to them.
Or you have to climb out a window and go up a fire escape or something.
Right. Yeah. So place them in areas where you can get to them relatively easy. I had a hive located probably about a mile away from my house on a friend's property. And I can tell you, I didn't get to that hive as frequently as I did to the ones in my own backyard. Oh. And so I felt that I neglected that hive a little bit more, especially on cold, icky, rainy days. And they had a real steep driveway. I didn't want to drive up that on icy days, to check on food storage. So yeah, placing them in a spot where you can get to them easily. And also make sure too, if you've got more than one hive, that you've got areas around them that you can work. You don't want them spaced real close together so that you end up bumping into them. That can cause some issues and make the neighboring hives defensive. So make sure that you've got room to work around them, and you want to be able to work them from the side or from behind and not in front of the hives, because that's going to be blocking the bees' flight path. And that's also something to consider too, is the bees' flight path versus your children's play path. Try not to have them in the same direction. Try to have them face away from one another, and everybody will be happy. Another thing to consider too is the orientation of the hives. Bees like to get that early morning light. So in that case, it would be kind of a southeast facing direction. So I try to place my hives in a location where they can get that southeast orientation. And then also, you might want to consider wind breaks. And if you don't have a windbreak around, and you're worried about maybe your top lid coming off, is placing some type of weight on there, like a brick or a large rock.
Where I hear this a lot from is our people who try to keep bees on the coast. I know we have some beekeepers in Astoria, and the wind is just fierce. You really need like a hedge to break the wind.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or, even just using like half of a cinder block, just something really heavy to anchor that down. And then another thing I would consider too is having a water source nearby for the bees. So the bees, they need water, and they'll use water, especially in the summer, to help cool their hives. They'll use that almost as for air conditioning. With the movement of their wings, they're able to create a cooling effect. And then, of course, they need water for drinking, but also to help with the curing of the honey too, with diluting some of the honey. So you'll want to have a water source nearby, and make sure to have that established early. And if you have that established early, then you train the bees, more or less, to always visit that area. And if you can train them to have that water source on your property, they're less likely to go to your neighbor's bird bath or water fountain or swimming pool. This last spring, 2020, my daughters, they were being very helpful. They said, "Hey, Mom, we're going to set out some frisbees full of water for the bees so that they've got water." I'm like, "Great, that's a great idea." I come home and they have placed frisbees with rocks in them on our retaining wall where I park my car. Well, the bees learned during spring and summer that that's their to-go place to get water. And so there's constant bees flying around every time I wanted to get into my car. So yes, bees learn where their water sources are. So those are some of the things I would take into consideration for figuring out where to place my hives.
Well, those are 5 great questions. And we got 5 more. So let's take a quick break, and we'll come back. And Anna, you've got a question about swarms. So I'm looking forward to hearing how you answer that basic question. Okay, we are back. There's a question I'm sure we've all heard many times. My bees swarmed. Now what? Anna, how do you answer that question?
Take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. Oh, don't hyperventilate. If you watch them swarm, which in itself is stunning. It's one of the most exciting things you can ever see. If they land in a spot where you can collect them, do so. And if they don't land in a spot where you can collect them, maybe someone from a bee club would be willing to go to a riskier. By that, I'm just assuming they're up too high, because that's what happens when my bees swarm, and I don't get them as they're up beyond my reach, because I'm not going to climb ladders way up high and use a bucket on the end of a long pole.
Those are the tricky ones. What I think is, like, sometimes they're way up high and you know, personal safety is an issue, being able to, because the bees themselves weigh something. And so once
they do,
you're going to talk about this in a second, but once the bees come down, it's like you're on the top of a ladder with this big weight suddenly in your arms. Yeah, but keep going.
And bees flying everywhere.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot about that part.
And it's usually hot too. So you're dripping sweat. Anyway. So if you can collect them, do so, which, just means knocking them into a bucket or a Rubbermaid container or a cardboard box that doesn't have a hole in the bottom, because we've had that issue. I don't understand why all the bees are gone. Well, there's a hole
in my bucket, like dear Liza.
Exactly. So anyway, this isn't really about collecting the swarm. Just calm down. It's a natural brood break. It's a natural part of a bee's life cycle. They're reproducing on a colony level. They've split. They were healthy enough that they figured they would be able to launch a satellite colony. Okay, don't do anything with the hive that swarmed. Just everybody's all agitated. They're just give them a day to settle down, and yourself. Yourself a day to settle down.
Have a stiff drink and sit back. Okay.
Yeah, there's just a lot of, maybe only takes a couple hours, but a day 24 hours won't hurt.
Okay.
So the bees will cap. They'll probably have more than one queen cell, usually multiples. And about day 8 or 9, right when there's capped, the leavers have left. So we still have a few more days. Well, 5, 6, 7 days until the queens emerge. So that gives you the break there. You can go in if there are 42 queen cells or a dozen queen cells. You could just do nothing,
right,
and see what happens. If there's a lot of queen cells and it's a very populous hive, they just might think, "Whoa, this is so fun! Let's do it again and again." So that's kind of one of those situations where you kind of learn those things by experience, by watching your bees go again and again. But anyway, you can do nothing. And in a matter of time, about 3 weeks, you should be seeing eggs again. And don't panic. It takes 3 weeks, maybe a little bit earlier, but you have to give time for the queen to emerge, for her exoskeleton, everything to get all organized and strong, and so that she then flies and mates. And then it takes a while for everything to get organized inside of her and before she starts laying eggs. So if you don't see any eggs at first, wait another week. and then look again.
I think that's great advice. It does take a little bit of time. And the thing I remember once being out with Dave Tarpey in a bee yard, and he pointed out to me that virgin queens are extremely skittish and weird and strange, and they do not like to be disturbed. And so in some ways, just leaving it shut for 3 weeks before, like you say, going in and checking it for eggs. I mean, she's going to come out and maybe, you may want to do some adjustments with queen cells, but really not constantly going in and trying to find her. Just wait till she starts laying.
Yeah. Give yourself a break.
I love that. You're so good. You're great advice. I love that. And I think I remember when, we were developing that best practices for, residential beekeepers, somebody pointed, we have something like, we use the word swarm prevention because it's really inevitable. Even every beekeeper is going to experience it. There's no swarm avoidance. It just is something that's going to happen. And you just have to, I like that advice of just staying calm and, assessing where you're at. That's such great advice.
Yes.
Okay. Our next question, which I know everybody asks, everybody from 2-year-old, as soon as they can speak onwards, how often should I expect to get stung, and will I develop an immunity to bees? The bee stings, Amber. Yeah. How do you answer that one?
Yes. Yes, there will be bee stings, unfortunately, but there are ways that you can minimize those from happening. But let's first kind of talk about the different types of bee stings that folks can reactions to those bee stings. And one of them is, it's just the local reaction. Once you get stung, it'll be discomfort. It may hurt. There might be some of the itchiness and redness and some of that swelling. And that's what we would call a localized reaction. And that can last, 24 to 48 hours, depending on how much venom was actually put through your skin. The more adverse reaction is what we would call anaphylaxis reaction, and that's where you start to get hives across your skin. You might get nauseous. You could develop some cramps. It might be difficult to breathe. And if you start feeling those or having some of those symptoms, that's when you need to call emergency response relatively quickly, because that could develop into some pretty scary situations. So those are the two types of reactions, but that anaphylaxis reaction, that is a really small percentage of the U.S. population where that would actually occur. And most of those folks know that they would respond to any type of sting, and they would oftentimes carry an EpiPen. Now, I am not a doctor. I do not work for a medical field, but I do know that, that ice packs and Benadryl can help ease some of that discomfort, especially of the localized reactions. Now, over time, beekeepers may become less reactive to some of these stings, but I wouldn't necessarily say immune to them. You might get stung multiple times, and it might protect against some of those future allergic reactions. They might not be as strong. You might not get as much swelling. But anytime you've got an overabundance of that bee venom, depending on how many times you get stung, it can cause some serious health issues, and not everyone's bodies are going to respond the same way. That's the thing to keep in mind is everybody's bodies are different. Now, having said that, though, there are ways that you can minimize getting stung. And one of them is to really work your bees gently. So you're going to use your smoker. So you'll be smoking them. And that smoking them helps keep the bees calm. It masks your scent. It encourages the bees to engorge on some of that honey. So then they're more apt to not pay as much attention to you. So just working them in a really calm, gentle manner. And you approach them I guess this would be mindfulness. It's a mindfulness type activity.
Yeah.
So just be really calm and gentle around them. And if you happen to notice that the bees are getting a little agitated, and when I mean agitated, if they start bouncing off of your veil or start kind of dive bombing you a little bit, that's telling you that they might not be appreciating you getting into their home right now. And when you start noticing that, come back another day. Let them settle down. Like as Anna was saying, is give them a little break, and you take a little break, close things up, and just come back another day.
That is great.
So that's one way to help minimize getting some of those stings. And also, 2 is work your bees when your kids aren't outside playing, when you don't have a whole bunch of neighbors around. So just minimizing the number of people around, because I remember observing the bees with my kids, and we were standing to the side and we were watching the bees. And this was when they were little, and the bees were coming in. We could see all the pollen coming in, and we're just getting excited and watching them. And the girls started to get a little animated and talking. Well, my husband was also standing next to us, and who is the one that got stung? My husband did, even though it was the girls that were moving around a lot and just being a little loud. So just by being calm and quiet around the bees helps minimize that too. And also work the bees when they're not home. So work them when they're out foraging, so you have less of a population inside the hive, and also do it when you've got a good nectar flow going on. When you start working the bees, come in the summer when there's not as much nectar for them, they might start to get a little more defensive, not enjoying you being inside their home, and there might be more prone to sting at that point. But really the take home message here is just to work them gently, be calm, and also smoke them when you need to, and keep that smoker lit too. That's a key point, because sometimes when you want to smoke them, you realize your smoker has already died out.
Yeah, right. Well, I suppose, that's one thing I often run into. People say, I'm allergic to bees. And then you talk to them a little bit. It's like, how do you know that? It's like, because my wrist, I could not bend my wrist the next day. And it's like, that's what you were describing, Amber, as a typical localized reaction. And some people, their very first sting, if they, haven't been beekeeping at all, their knuckles may disappear.
Yeah. And there will be some swelling. And that's the other thing too, to kind of watch for, is usually that first sting, you're okay. It's the second sting that you need to watch for to see what type of reactions you're going to be developing on more of a future basis. And then the other key too is, did you really get stung by a honeybee, or was it a yellow jacket? Was it a bald-faced hornet? Was it a paper wasp? Everybody says, I got stung by a bee. But more than likely, it was those nasty yellow jackets.
Such a great transition to our next question, Anna. So, Anna, you do a lot of Ask an Expert questions. So you deal a lot with public questions. And as a fellow Ask an Expert, which is this great service provided by the Extension Service, you can submit a gardening question, any question, you get an answer. Anna, you answer a lot of those questions. I'm sure there comes this point in July and August when you start getting yellow jacket questions. And I know the one that beekeepers ask me, and they've asked you, will yellow jacket traps, those little traps that you hang from the trees, kill my bees?
And the short answer is no, because the bees won't go in there. The attractant in those yellow jacket traps is a pheromone lure lure specifically aimed at yellow jackets. And they're the ones that go in there and by the thousands. So that was the short answer. For beekeepers out there, they can go to the Oregon State, so it's OSU Publications catalog, and download the publication Protecting Honeybees from Yellow Jacket Wasps. Because yellow jackets, late summer, so August, at least in the Pacific Northwest, because we have a lack of rain in the summer. We don't get rain from July, August, and into September. Some years, 10 weeks without rain. So it gets really dry. The insects have kind of vanished, and yellow jackets are hungry. They are looking to feed those developing queens, and so they naturally gravitate to honeybee colonies because, whoa, look at all this food that's here. They have honey. They've been working hard. Let's go in and steal it. Ooh, they have larvae. Look at all this meat here. And they're all here. So, it's just a natural reaction.
I do imagine that's what a yellow jacket's brain sounds like. Like that was the perfect snippet.
So, to them, a honeybee colony is just a feast on wings. So I guess that's kind of off the question, isn't it?
No, this is really good. I do think that's. I often, there's the question of whether the yellow jacket traps are going to kill the bees, but I think this whole question of protecting beehives at this critical period where the yellow jacket predation can get really extensive is really important. As you pointed out, the OSU Extension catalog, and we'll put it in the show notes, has a great guide on you as a beekeeper and how you can, help your colony's chances to deal with this hungry horde.
And yellow jackets are really, really useful. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to just mindlessly destroy them if you can protect your bees otherwise, because they eat a lot of things that we don't want in our gardens.
Amber is kind of doing a reluctant nod.
If only yellow jackets didn't drive me indoors when I try to eat outside on my deck.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the one thing about, Western Oregon is nice and dry, but man, you can't eat outside.
No.
All right. So Amber, next question, number 9 on our list. Can I have a honeybee hive in my backyard if I live in the city? How many hives should I start with and or have?
Yes and no. So one of the things you'll want to check is that some municipalities and counties, they might have limits on the number of colonies that you can have on your property. So, and other places may not have any limits at all. So you'll want to find out what those colony limits are. Okay, so a hive is what a colony lives in, and some people get that terminology a little mixed up. So find out from the area that you live in, city, town, county, if there are any rules against the number of hives that you can have in your backyard. And also some neighborhoods, there's a number of neighborhoods now that have HOAs and or CC&Rs. And so you'll want to double check those too. Some may not allow bees may or may not be considered livestock, and livestock may or may not be allowed within the city limits where you are. I know some HOAs don't allow chickens, and also bees would fall into that category too. So really check out those rules. And the second thing that I think is really, really important is be sure to talk with your neighbors. talk with your neighbors about beekeeping before you set up your hives or your small little apiary. It's an important thing to do. It's educational for your neighbors, and it's also a common courtesy. And a lot of neighbors, they might be under the assumption that honeybees act the same way that yellow jackets do. And so there's a really good educational opportunity there to talk about the differences between yellow jackets and or other wasps compared to honeybees and their behavior and temperament. And it's always a good idea too to make sure your neighbors get a jar of honey every year too. and as Anna was talking about swarms, I have found my neighbors to be a great resource for swarms because they've got my number and they can call me and say, "Hey, Amber, I've got a swarm in my backyard." And I can just say, "Great. Are you okay if I come in and collect them?" And so just having really good relationship with your neighbors, I think is key. Get them on board too with your project. Either way, make sure that you can manage them. You're going to want to know how many hives you feel comfortable managing. So if you're a beginning beekeeper, taking on 10 hives would be astronomical. I mean, you're already at a learning curve just trying to figure out the bee's life cycle, the different management, that seasonal managements that you have to take on. So starting with 10 might be way too high. So start with a number of hives that you feel comfortable managing. Another thing too is only add hives as you feel if your experience level has increased, and always too monitor for defensiveness of your hives. So if your hives start to get a little defensive, that could cause for some nuisance issues, especially with your neighbors. And so you'll want to make sure that your bees are still have that gentle temperament and figure out ways that you can diminish the defensiveness of those hives. And those are kind of the key points that I would consider, placing those hives in your backyards and dealing with how many you feel comfortable working with. So again, I go back to beginning beekeepers starting with 1 or 2 hives and then working your way up from there. And keep in mind too, naturally, they're just going to increase on you because as your bees start to swarm, you're going to collect them. Your 2 hives have now become 4. Your 4 have now become 8. And so it can be a growing but good problem.
Well, it does remind me here in Oregon, and Amber, you played a big role in sort of getting education out on this. We do have another OSU publication that we'll have in the show notes that kind of walks you through the steps to take for keeping bees in residential areas. And in some areas, unfortunately, as you were mentioning, Amber, there will be either within an HOA or something, but even more broadly in a whole city where bees aren't permitted. So
that's true. And I do find, education is the key on this. And so, for instance, the neighborhood that I am in has an HOA, and they have restrictions against having chickens because they're considered livestock. Well, I really wanted honeybees. So what I did, and I think my daughters helped too, is we put together a small little presentation and said, this is what we're going to do with honeybees. Are you okay if we do this? And the HOA board was on board with it, but they did say, we would like you to limit the number of hives that you have. That's great. I can do that. And they also didn't want my hives painted like fluorescent pink or bright orange. What? Yeah, I know. They wanted them to blend in with more than blend in with kind of the natural surrounding, because we don't have a fenced backyard, and there's actually a little bit of a trail that goes in our backyard. And so, they didn't want them to be really obnoxious. And again, that adds to part of the security. So if I have big, bright orange, pink hives sitting out there, that's pretty eye-catching. But if I can camouflage my hives a little bit, then people are less likely to see them.
Folks, if you want to have fluorescent pink colonies, move to Malheur. Okay. Last question, Anna. How long this is a great question. I save this to last because this is what people are going to be in this situation in just a couple months. They're going to get their package, they're going to get their nuke, and they want to know, how long do I feed it? When does the umbilical cord get cut?
And it's hard. It's hard because they're your babies. But bees are pretty much self-sufficient. Yeah, once there are flowers blooming, they can survive on their own. What you're doing by feeding is giving them a boost. If you get a package, that means they have no comb drawn, so they have to draw comb and store honey and raise brood in order to survive the winter. If you have a nucleus, if you purchase a nucleus colony, you come with the original 3, 4, or 5 frames, but they still have the rest of your 8 or 10 frames in 2 boxes that they need to fill out. So by feeding them, you are making it easier for the bees, and it saves them time and it saves them energy. I mean, it feeds their wax production. It stimulates them to produce wax. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how long do you feed them?
Right.
So 1 box, you wait until there's 80% of the frames are drawn. That means. So, and then you can add the second box. You still keep feeding until that one is 80% drawn. And then you can, stop feeding them.
That is such great advice. I've run into people who have this problem where they come out of the first season without enough drawn comb. And the way that you've described it, just really making it geared towards you stop feeding when you have enough comb drawn out, because you're really using that syrup to draw the comb out. So yes. Sensible. You've helped a lot of people just because, they come they go into winter with there's nothing worse than going into winter with 4 or 5 drawn comb and a bunch of foundation on the edge. That's a terrible state of affairs.
Yeah, and they have to draw the comb in the honey supers on their own, because otherwise you're going to have sugar syrup honey.
Right.
Yummy.
Okay, guys. Well, this is fantastic. These are 10 great tips, and these are 10 questions. If you're just starting with beekeeping, these are going to come to your head, and you've really had some expert people kind of guide you through those, two beekeepers who've gone through a lot of training, but also have gone through a lot of beekeeping to bring you this advice. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sin and Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollination.podcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.